Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this week's performance of My Favorite Flop.
Welcome back!
Thanks for tuning back into My Favorite Flop.
Episode 2. Can you even believe it?
It's very exciting. We're so excited to be back with everyone. All right, Bobby, how was your week?
My week was good. It's crazy. The world is still upside down. January, who would have thought? But we're here. We're alive. We're healthy.
So what have you been listening to this week?
I told you last week I was going to listen to 6, and I had every intention of doing it, and I didn't. So this week I have actually been listening to, you're going to laugh at this one, but it's a good one. Demos from the abandoned Jim Steinman Batman musical.
Wow. That is quite impressive.
No, they're quite magical. I don't know if I would say they're good, but they're magical. And I have been listening to them, and they've been quite lovely. So that is what I have been listening to. Kristina, what have you been listening to?
What have I been listening to? I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks, which doesn't really pertain to this. But I've been kind of going through my Miller Time playlist, which includes a lot of obscure rock music.
Oh yeah. Yeah, like what?
Like Reliant K.
Okay.
For anyone who knows them, they're the best. For anyone who doesn't know them, go look them up. They're pretty awesome. And I've always said that Reliant K, if you took Reliant K songs, you could make a musical because they write story songs, which is not necessarily normal for rock songs.
Right.
Especially rock songs from like 2004. But they are inspired by the Beach Boys and the Beatles, and so they have a lot of really fun sounds and harmonies in their work, and they just write really silly stuff. A lot of people know Sadie Hawkins dance by them. Sadie Hawkins dance in my khaki pants. There's nothing better, and ow, ow, ow. Girls, that's a guys. No, okay.
No.
I could go on, but
but you can't because of copyright. So we might have to cut, snip, snip, a little bit of that.
I'm your biggest fan, Reliant K. Don't be mad.
So Reliant K, I've never heard of them before, but it's on my list. So this week I am determined I'm going to listen to 6 and I'm going to listen to Reliant K so I can at least be like, yeah, those were great suggestions. Or Kristina.
What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you? Okay, so we're here and it's episode 2 and we have a really exciting show this week on My Favorite Flop. Are you ready to tell them what it is, Kristina?
I'm so excited.
All right, so let's go through the clues, Kristina. We gave some good ones, and we have clue number 5 to give today. So the first one we gave at the end of last episode.
Right, which was that the London production was led by Luke Evans of Beauty and the Beast fame.
I mean other things too, but
other things
yes, too. Luke Evans, Beauty and the Beast, Gaston.
But we're trying to connect it to musical themes.
Okay, fine. Okay, and clue number 2, which we put on Twitter, was that the show opened on November 13th, 2003 on Broadway.
And then we have clue number 3, which was on Instagram, and that was a visual clue, a corner of the poster.
Which was followed by that wonderful blog post about musicals based on the lives of pop stars, because clue number 4 was that this musical is based on the life of a pop star. And Kristina, are you ready? Give them clue number 5.
Clue number 5. The lead producer of this musical was a famous talk show host at the time.
All right.
What is it, Bobby? Tell
Taboo!
me what it is. Taboo!
So, yeah, this musical is interesting because it is a flop. I don't think that anyone would argue with the fact that this show didn't necessarily do very well on Broadway. However, this show has a huge cult following. I have met so many people in my life who are obsessed with this show. One of which, Nick DeGruccio. It's a big one. People really have strong feelings about this show. And
really strong feelings. A friend of mine was in the ensemble on Broadway, and he said, I mean, this man has worked on massive shows, but he has always said that Taboo was one of those shows for him that was a highlight of his career.
Oh,
because
wow.
it was so special. It was so special to him to work on that show.
Right. So where do we jump in? Where should we jump in with this?
Well, we should probably chat briefly about where Taboo comes from.
Right. So at the heart of it, and no matter what production you look at, it is a musical about, kind of, sort of, Boy George, famous pop star, and his friends in the club scene of the 1980s. That at the heart of Taboo, that is the general plot of what it is. And when I was doing my research for today's episode, that's kind of what the genesis of it all was about. Is somebody approached Boy George in the early 2000s and said, "Hey, why don't you write a musical about your life?" And he said, "Ugh, I'm not interested in that at all." And then this guy was basically like, "Well, what if you write a musical kind of about your life?" And he's like, "I could get on board with that." So that's where Taboo came into being.
Yeah, I mean, the club scene was fascinating. I looked at some clips from the Broadway production, and those costumes, man. I mean, the drag scene for what the club era is incredible, and it just makes me want to watch Drag Race all over again.
It's crazy you bring up Drag Race because, Boy George and his posse were big in the London, club scene, but in New York City, famously, with like Michael Alig and of course RuPaul was very much part of that scene in New York City, like while it was happening in the UK. So it's interesting because so much of what RuPaul's Drag Race is today, it's such a popular show. RuPaul is now leading Old Navy commercials, it's all over my TV. It's so much of it harkens back to what this musical is about in that era, and the makeup and the, costumes and the partying and the music and just so much of it. And Taboo really kind of celebrated it, I think, before it became mainstream. And it was produced in the early, 2002, 2003 at a time that this wasn't really mainstreamed.
Who was it produced by, Bobby?
Well, Rosie O'Donnell, obviously, which is part of the legend and lore of Taboo. You can't talk about Taboo without mentioning Rosie, because even though she didn't produce the original London production, she produced the Broadway production, and so much of the myth and mystery surrounding it, which we're going to get into, is the fact that she was the lead producer on this and put $10 million of her own personal money into the show to bring it to Broadway.
Whoa, that is a lot.
That's a lot of money.
I was looking into what was going on during the time of when this opened. So this opened in November 13th, 2003, right? And that's only 2 years after 9/11. And 9/11, for those who don't know, decimated Broadway. It shut
decimated.
It down.
Decimated Broadway.
In 2003, we invaded Iraq. There were the bombings in Istanbul. And on top of that, tourism was down a crazy amount in New York because people were concerned about traveling, one, the safety of the city, two, and also there was all of these lawsuits happening with air quality and the cleanup that was happening in downtown with the Twin Towers, and then green lighting the new tower. And then I learned this while I was doing this research, but apparently the Statue of Liberty was shut down for those 2 years.
Oh, yeah.
And so even when Taboo opened, the Statue of Liberty wasn't open, and it just got funding privately. It got a private donation, so that way they could up their security and open it back up to the public. But that wasn't going to happen until mid-2004.
Oh, wow. Well, It was such 9/11 is considered one of the things that almost killed Broadway. So many fantastic shows that we might actually cover on this podcast. They're going to be ones that we're going to talk about, and we're going to be like, this shouldn't have flopped. If the Twin Towers hadn't fallen, they would not be on this podcast. After 9/11, Do you know what musical was considered to be the show that saved Broadway after 9/11, right?
Yeah, I believe it's Wicked, isn't it?
No, Mamma Mia.
Oh, Mamma Mia.
Mamma Mia, which came to Broadway, and people say that if it had opened prior to 9/11, it might have ran, but it took over, and that's all people wanted was ABBA songs and a plot from some movie that I don't even remember the name of the title. It's based on a movie, believe it or not.
That I did not know.
But that's what people wanted after 9/11. And if you look at what won the Tony for Best Musical in those following years, things like The Producers was popular, things like Hairspray. People wanted big musical comedies. They wanted to feel better about themselves. They wanted positivity. The world of Broadway was very specific. So for something like Taboo to come into existence was so left field.
Well, and it was also still competing with La Boheme was on during that season. So was Rent. Rent was still running. You had all these other Boy from Oz also. So you had all these giant feel-good LGBTQ based musicals. Well, I guess Rent isn't feel-good, but it already had such a life and such a love in New York and with the general public that it could live on through 9/11. And then you also had Wicked open 2 weeks before Taboo opened.
Oh yeah, it opened around Halloween. So
it opened October 30th, 2003. Yeah. And then you also had Avenue Q. And Avenue Q actually won Best Musical that year over Wicked, which shocked everyone.
Shocked the world. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so a little show like Taboo, unfortunately, I don't think stood a chance.
Well, it's funny that you say little because the original West End production absolutely was. It was produced in essentially a basement that had been converted into a theater. I think it may have actually been a nightclub at one point.
It was, yeah.
And it was done very small. I think I read it had 350 seats, which on Broadway, you can't even have a Broadway theater unless it has 500 seats or more. So it's smaller than what we would even consider Broadway. It didn't really have polished choreography. The direction was very, just it was a basement. We would consider it an off-Broadway show,
Right.
And it had a modest run in the UK. And then Rosie O'Donnell threw over 10 million at it and made it this Broadway thing. But the whole point I was trying to say is people were considering it to be the battle with Wicked before it opened, before anything happened. Rosie was throwing this money at it. It was this big splashy thing. So it started as a small thing, but people referred to Wicked and Taboo as being the big blockbusters of that season. Wow. They were the big money shows. Avenue Q was the little guy. Caroline or Change was the nonprofit little guy. This was expected before anything got out, before previews started, before any of the drama kind of made its way into the press. People expected big things out of this. This was supposed to be a big juggernaut, which is crazy to think about.
I mean, the music in Taboo is so much fun. There's that song, I think it's the second or third song in the show, and it's this big, epic, belting song from the female, and it is so much fun.
Oh, I have to see if I can find it.
There's a lot of songs like that in the show, and they do a couple of Boy George singles and stuff. Right. But the music is so much fun.
Well, that's the crazy thing is, so going into researching this episode, I really didn't know a lot about Taboo. I thought it was a jukebox musical. It is not really. It is an original score written by Boy George and some other people that features like one or two, maybe two songs, popular songs.
Come a Chameleon and what was his other big one?
Do You Really Want to Hurt Me?
Thank you. Yeah, and he was nominated for a Tony for Best Original Score.
And people thought he was going to win. It's interesting because in the US, the show didn't get the best reviews, but the reviewers, or at least the critics, did praise what Boy George had done as far as writing was concerned. And people thought that it was in the bag that he would win Best Score at the Tony Awards that year. And that's clearly not what happened. In fact,
but Boy George was in the show.
He was. Okay, so we have to go back because we're talking about the Broadway version, but like, so it opened in the West End in this warehouse with Luke Evans, who's a big movie star now, and he's young. I watched, so they filmed the West End production, believe it or not,
Yeah, you
and
can buy it on DVD.
you can buy it on DVD. I watched the entire thing, and it's so interesting to see how young he looks because I don't consider him to be a particularly old actor, but he looks like a child, and he kind of talks like a child, and he's like a young ingenue, like boy next door kind of guy. And now he's Luke Evans, which is just blows my mind. But it's him. It's Ewan Morton, which I think basically this show discovered him.
Yeah, because Ewan ended up going with it to New York.
Well, because it's freakish. So listeners, I watched the West End production, but Kristina was able to watch the Broadway production, and Ewan is in both of them. He's the only real cast member from the original cast to come and do both. It's freakish how close he looks and sounds like Boy George, right?
Yes. I actually found an interview that Boy George did when the show was about to move to New York. And he was doing an interview with Graham Norton. And those who don't know Graham Norton, just go and do a deep dive into YouTube because it's some of the best interviews you'll ever watch.
They're pretty awesome.
He was talking about how he's not playing himself. He's playing a different character in the show. But that they found Ewan, and he was like, "What's great about Ewan? He has my nose."
Yeah,
like of all things.
Oh my!
But it is. He really emulates him, and he has such an ease to him on the stage. Watching Ewan was so much fun.
So yeah, so Ewan did it in the West End. Something I learned, he's not in the video because Boy George plays Lee Bowery in the video of the West End production, and he played the role on Broadway as well. He opened the Broadway production, but that role was originally done by Matt Lucas from Little Britain. Like, are you a fan? I wish I had video of Matt Lucas doing it because Boy George is good in the role, but Matt Lucas would have been epic.
Spectacular.
I'm imagining all of the things that I watched Lee Bowery do in the show, at least on the West End production. I'm like, yeah, Matt Lucas was probably better in that role.
So Ewan actually wasn't the first choice.
No, he was cast in another role in the original workshop. I think the role was called
or something.
It was called Trojan or something. That's what I found in some interview.
And then the guy who was playing Boy George got sick or injured or something. And so they called him in from the ensemble to take over for a couple nights. And they're like, nope, this is it. It was a total Sutton Foster and Millie moment.
Oh my goodness. Well, unfortunately, Ewan did not win a Tony Award for this, but he was nominated. He was nominated
for a Drama Desk.
He might have won something.
He won the Theatre World Award.
Right. Which is a big deal.
Esparza, who I adore, won the Drama Desk for his featured role in the show. And for those of you who have not seen his costume in this show, please go look it up. It is amazing.
Right. So, yeah. So the show went from London. Rosie saw it in this basement. The critics actually liked it in the UK, but it didn't run for a very long time. I don't know if I would say the London production necessarily flopped so much as it just kind of existed and then it closed. And but Rosie saw it, brought it to Broadway, and like you were saying, Raul Esparza joined the cast. So they did so much. There's so much.
They rewrote the show.
So yeah. So in the West End, in the UK, the show is about these people in the club scene, but they wrote a fictional love story between this guy named Billy, who is a photographer, who runs away from home, runs to the city, wants to be involved. And then this girl named Kim, who's like in the club scene. They call her a goth, but I don't, whatever. And it's this love scene between the two of them. So it's this very classic heteronormative love story set against this world. So everyone else is a peripheral character, and it's made to be more digestible for the audience. When they brought it to Broadway, they're like, nah, let's just ditch those characters and make it about Boy George, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I went and read the synopsis of the London version, and I actually found it really convoluted. I couldn't keep things straight when I was reading it, because they wanted to focus on Boy George, but like you said, they created Billy and they were focusing on him and his family issues, but then kept bringing it back to Boy George. And I'm like, well, who am I supposed to be paying attention to?
Right.
And then when they brought it to Broadway, like we said, they completely cut Billy and all of his family characters, and that entire storyline went out the window, and it became more about Boy George and his relationships in the club scene. But thinking back on it, without having a person like Billy who's never been a part of the club scene and comes in to it, that is allows the audience to be the voyeur, right? To be the fly on the wall, to watch what happens within this world.
Right.
And losing that, I think I understand why they cut all of it, because it was just too much. But I think if they had kept Billy to a certain degree, it would have been more digestible for larger masses, right? For the more general public, to then learn about this amazing subculture, basically.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you look at a show like Cabaret, and for all intents and purposes, because the role of Clifford in that show, I think is meant to represent the author, the guy who wrote Berlin Stories, it kind of is framed that way. And depending on what production you see, it's really framed that way or it's not. But the reason I think that show works is that Sally is just as much an integral part of the story as is the MC. So they have this really, you watch it and Cliff is very much the gateway into that story. But it's still very much a story about Sally Bowles, and all of this other stuff. And I think that that's not the case with the original West End production of Taboo. It's not, here's this dude who's going to tell us about this stuff, because Boy George is the more interesting character and he's oftentimes not the focal point. And then he comes in and you're like, wait, do I care about you or do I care about Billy? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, exactly. And it's also interesting because in the London version, they kind of play with this idea of exploring sexuality, because Boy George kind of falls in love with Billy and it's unrequited, and Billy trying to figure out if that's who he is or if it's not, or and there's a little bit of that, but there's just not enough time to delve into things like that in this musical.
It's kind of hinted at, it's very clear in the London production that Billy is straight. But he is willing to flirt with men, kind of, sort of, to get what he wants, but nothing more than just very surface passing. You don't see him make out with Boy George at some point. You know what I mean? You don't see them do anything to be like, oh, he's really this kind of confused, or it's more, it doesn't go far enough to kind of explore that area, which is why I think one of the reasons on Broadway they added the Boy George's boyfriend character, which kind of fulfills that, right?
Right.
Because it goes full on. He's like, no, I'm straight. Just kidding.
Just kidding. Yeah.
Well,
I think that this show had so many possibilities.
Right.
So many possibilities. And I don't know if it was that it needed another workshop, since they were going to do such a dramatic change before bringing it to Broadway. But at the same time, what they did bring to Broadway was so much fun. And I think really celebrated club culture as well as the LGBTQ community, which ironically at the time, earlier in 2003, Massachusetts Supreme Court had ruled it unconstitutional to ban same-sex marriages, which is it was a win for the LGBTQ
Was
community.
that the first state?
I believe so.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's interesting because, now, at least in the worlds that, well, it's legal nationwide. I remember when it wasn't legal anywhere. So it's kind of insane to think back to that time period. But 2003 wasn't the most liberated America. So this musical was very queer, very in your face. And the marketing campaign, which a lot of people blame, as one of the reasons that the musical didn't do well was very much embraced that. Like the posters and the billboards for Taboo on Broadway, not in the West End, but on Broadway, they were like pictures of men peeing at a urinal. You know what I mean? Suggesting like sketchy, like gay bathroom sex. And it's like, come see Taboo. This is Broadway.
Which is interesting because that's not what it celebrates.
No, and like some of the merchandise, one of the things that I saw was they sold keychains, like as you do for a Broadway show, but they had condoms inside. Like, here's your emergency condom. So I was really trying to push something that I don't even know if the musical was. You know what I mean? So it was a very confusing marketing campaign that surrounded the show.
That's so interesting because in all of my research on this, none of it felt like it was about, I mean, it's about sexuality, of course, but it's not about sex.
No, it was more about just like expression and art, you know, expressing yourself and expressing who you really are and things. I actually think that Taboo would probably do a lot better today than it did back in 2003.
I think that we should inspire RuPaul to executive produce the revival and they go back in and fix the script problems. That's what I think.
Well, the script. Okay. So that's obviously that changed. So the original book writer was replaced when it moved to Broadway.
Oh, wow.
And do you know who replaced them?
No.
So Charles Busch, which is a famous queer playwright, you may have heard of some of his plays, Vampire Lesbians of Sodom. No? But no, Psycho Beach Party, which is also a movie that I adore with Lauren Ambrose. He did it as a play off Broadway. Die Mommy Die is a movie that he did.
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
He's a famous drag performer, but he wrote plays for himself to be in. And The Tale of the Allergist's Wife, that was a big like play on Broadway.
That's just a silly title.
Who starred in that one? I think Linda Lavin starred in it.
Nice.
And that one wasn't a drag show at all. But this is a celebrated queer playwright in New York City, was brought in to rewrite the book. And people who saw his first draft, because there was so much crazy press around the show. So like reporters were like having spies in rehearsals and in backstage meetings and getting stuff sent to them. Michael Riedel at the New York Post famously had a vendetta against this show and was constantly writing stories about it, airing all the dirty laundry, but claimed that he had been given the first draft of the script and it was just wonderful. And that reportedly during rehearsals, so much of it had been thrown out. And there's a lot of conflicting stuff as to why so many good beats of dialogue didn't end up on the Broadway stage. But a lot of it's alluded to the fact that Boy George, or George O'Dowd is his real name, ended up being in it. And he's a fantastic performer, but maybe not the strongest actor. So there were moments to flesh out the characters more and things like that. And the director or Boy George, if things weren't working or if he wasn't able to make things happen, they didn't end up on stage, which I think probably didn't help.
Yeah,
the overall.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
It'd be fun. I think that they should bring back Matt Lewis to do it. Or Matt Lucas, sorry. Bring back Matt Lucas when they do the revival. RuPaul, hello. And RuPaul, I think you should play Marilyn. That's what I think.
RuPaul should play Marilyn. Oh my goodness. Well, I think Matt Lucas could still do it. I think, you bring up RuPaul and you brought up RuPaul twice now. I think that obviously in RuPaul culture, I think Taboo absolutely makes sense for a revival, but I think several queens from the show could be in it. Like, I don't know how well we've actually never talked RuPaul, me and you. So I don't know how much you watch.
Up to season 11.
Great. So Jinx Monsoon should play.
I love Jinx Monsoon.
No, but that's who you get to play Lee Bowery. She could sing it and she would be fantastic. So because there aren't a lot of girls who actually sing on the show, but there are a couple.
Yeah, no, there are. I mean, Mattel
Trixie,
has an entire album.
Trixie, I knew you were going to say Trixie.
Yeah, I mean, she's great. And there are some queens on that show who are truly fantastic performers, fantastic actors.
Right.
And you could easily pull from their fandom. And what would be fun is, like I've mentioned with Six before, if you got a rotation of them.
Right.
Right? Because there's
Absolutely.
so many to choose from. Why not put them on rotation?
Right. Yeah, I think it could be redone. Well, okay, so so you watched the Broadway production. What are some things that you feel didn't work? I mean, I think we've established that the score is fantastic, and again, that was the opinion at the time. Even the critics who didn't like the show thought the score was wonderful. The story maybe not so good. What were some other things you felt about what you watched that didn't work?
Honestly, some of it was actually really hard to understand for American actors who were trying to do these UK dialects.
Right.
That's one of my pet peeves is bad UK dialects. For those of you who don't know, if we didn't mention it earlier, my husband is a Brit, so there's that. And so some of it was actually quite difficult to understand, and I don't think some of the comedy landed because the American actors didn't actually understand the comedy.
Right.
Which is something that you have to deal with. I mean, we saw that with Matilda and some other, even Kinky Boots. Like, I think Kinky Boots is far more successful a show in London than it is here.
Really?
It is some of the best musical theater work I've ever seen in my life.
Really?
And I
Okay.
did not like the American production at all.
Oh no, I saw it on Broadway 3 times and I loved it. But
Anyway,
to each,
so I think that
their own.
There was some of that. There was translation problems, so to speak. I actually really loved. I know that I've read some reviews from fans who don't love the choreography from the Broadway production, but I actually loved it.
Right.
It reminded me a lot of Wedding Singer, which is, I have a special place in my heart for that show.
Right.
It definitely had that feel to it. I also like that it wasn't like a really elaborate set. It was super simple. It reminded me a lot of Jersey Boys, actually. It had the 2 tiers and it was very simple. It had a wall that they utilized in the back where they could do projection and stuff like that. I don't know. It also didn't feel like there was a really strong antagonist.
Right.
Like there wasn't really a villain.
Right.
There wasn't anything besides like Boy George's drug abuse problems. There wasn't a lot of fight happening. And I think that, again, that comes back to the book. And I think that they could make that clearer.
Yeah.
In a certain way, or give him a better antagonist to follow. I really loved Ewan in it, and his work in it was absolutely beautiful. And Raul Esparza steals the show every time he's on stage, which, I mean, that's just par for the course. Yeah, so that was kind of my takeaway from it, is I didn't know what Boy George was fighting for.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, I haven't seen it, the Broadway version, obviously, but I've read a lot about it. It's interesting because Raul Esparza and Liz McCartney, who play Philip and Big Sue, they're smaller characters in the West End. In fact, Big Sue is an extremely minor character in the West End production, and Philip is a larger one, but not the same way. They narrate the Broadway show. It's kind of done flashback, right? They're like in modern day, and from what I read, he spins a disco ball, and they go back to the 80s, and everything happens.
I mean, there was a little bit of that. It wasn't as prevalent. Like it wasn't even something that really stuck with me, that aspect of the show.
So it didn't feel like they were narrating, like they didn't have bits where it was like, we're going to tell you stuff, or
there were moments of that. Like there was monologuing to the audience, very a la, again, Jersey Boys.
Sure.
But it wasn't as thick as Jersey Boys is. Like Jersey Boys is all monologuing to the audience, right? And this wasn't that much narration. It has some, but not a ton.
Okay. All right. Well, so do you think, I mean, obviously the show has issues, it's not a perfect musical, but there are very few perfect musicals, and plenty of shows that are not perfect run for a very long time. I think we'll get into briefly about some of the reasons why externally the show didn't do well. But do you think that, barring the things that we're about to talk about, do you think that if that show that you had watched opened at a different time, that it might be successful, or do you think that it may have flopped regardless?
No, I think that it would have been more successful had it not been running against these other massive shows.
Right. That's a huge thing is there's an entire documentary about this Broadway season called Show Business. And it chronicles, the Broadway season of Wicked, Carolina Change, Avenue Q, and Taboo, which at the start of the season, everyone expected to be, the 4 nominees for Best Musical. And the one that didn't end up getting the nomination, obviously, was this one. But that's not what people expected.
It obviously was a letdown to the critics of Broadway, which is unfortunate. But I think because they did a revival in London, I believe, in 2012 that did all right. Wasn't as successful as I think it could be. I think if it got in the right hands and lucked out with the right season,
right,
in terms of what else is it going against, I think it could do really, really well because it has such a wonderful cult following to it already. And the spirit of the show is so heartfelt and so much fun. It could easily open up to a wider audience than the LGBTQ community. So yeah, I think that in the right season and in the right hands, it could really be successful.
Yeah, and I think that might mean, unfortunately, that Miss Rosie O'Donnell. I mean, we haven't really talked much about that, but it might mean that Rosie might have to let someone else take the reins because a lot of the controversy surrounding the show was Rosie O'Donnell. She produced.
Does she still own the rights to it?
She does, or at least she did up until recently, at least in the United States. She personally retained the rights to it. She has talked over the years about how she wants to revive it and fix it, even recently. And she's barred anyone else from doing it. The rights never got released to Taboo. You can't license it to do it anywhere else, in the United States, at least. I don't know about the UK, but it's interesting that the UK revival had the same director. It brought back the original book writer and put all the, Billy, all those characters back into the show. But Rosie produced it, and this is 2003. And it's interesting now because so many people have negative opinions about her in 2020. And this is kind of when all of that first started. She was the queen of daytime talk show in the late 1990s. In fact, there were moments she was even more popular than Oprah was. Which is a big deal, which is why when Oprah got her own TV network, who did she hire? Rosie O'Donnell. Didn't work out well, but Rosie's show was really popular and she loved Broadway. I mean, she basically credits herself of discovering Kristen Chenoweth, featuring her on the Rosie show back before she won her Tony and was famous, and loves Broadway, what still to this day loves Broadway. And she came out. So this is some interesting stuff that I want to point out because the show is a queer show and came out
Did she come out after producing this?
No, she came out in 2002, right before Taboo went in, and just like Ellen, received a lot of backlash from everybody when she came out. Even though I don't think there's anyone who didn't know that Rosie O'Donnell was a lesbian before she came out of the closet, but the minute she came out of the closet, opinions changed very, very stark. Ellen has been able to shift the tide, but Ellen basically got blackballed from Hollywood when she came out, and Rosie, very similar situation. So she came out in 2002, and then she also quit her magazine, the Rosie magazine, that year because she didn't feel like
she had a magazine.
Yes, so she took over. I think it was McCall's magazine, which is a women's magazine. They rebranded it as Rosie magazine. And I think she was editor-in-chief, and she quit in 2002 and became embroiled in all of these crazy lawsuits with the magazine, back and forth, suing each other. And you probably didn't know this. The trial was the week that Taboo opened on Broadway, her big trial, getting sued by these magazine people. And at the time, everyone was like, the Queen of Nice, because that was her nickname, has turned into the Queen of Mean, and everyone was airing her dirty laundry. So the entire rehearsal process of Taboo and all of the previews and the Broadway run, it was like all the rag magazines,
It was
all they wanted
tainted.
tainted. And so it's like Rosie couldn't even breathe above water, dealing with all of this stuff. And here she is. She put $10 million of her own money into the show and it's not working. And she's hardly able to fix it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's heartbreaking.
So that whole drama, like, it's unfortunate because there are few people who I love Broadway as much as Rosie O'Donnell does. Say what you will. There are few public figures that have a heart on their sleeve for the Broadway community.
Yeah, she's a real champion, isn't she?
She is, and she does really great work with Rosie's kids in New York. She has a performing arts school where she works with young performers in the city, and they do fantastic work. And she puts so much money. I don't know. It's a shame because this was really her big thing, and it didn't
pan out.
It didn't pan out, no. And so, yeah, if it comes back, the whole point I was saying is I don't know if Rosie can be attached to it because it might just be one of those like Mark
Curse.
of Cain. Like,
I mean, maybe she should just be a silent partner.
Maybe. Maybe. Yeah,
or
I don't know.
Maybe it'll be what revives her.
Maybe. I mean, maybe people don't.
I'm a huge fan of Rosie O'Donnell. I think she's hilarious.
Here's the thing: I've always said that whenever there's a Donald Trump musical, God save us.
No.
Rosie O'Donnell will be the Che to his Ava. You know what I mean? Because remember they used to just publicly fight with each other all the time. Do you remember that at all?
No. I wasn't very good at pop culture, though. Let's be real.
Oh, they used to attack before president, like just on TV, they would attack each other. Anyway, maybe now that Donald Trump has been arguably the worst president in United States history, I can say that on this podcast. It might get cut.
So.
That maybe people don't hate Rosie as much as they used to. And maybe
called it. She called it.
So that happened. I'm trying to think what else. The controversy has to go away. The director, oh gosh, the whole director. Did you know this? You
No.
didn't. Okay. So the show was directed by, I have to look at my notes. The show in the original West End production was directed by Christopher Renshaw. Okay. And he is a British director, but had famously directed the 1996 revival of King and I with Donna Murphy. It was a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
Famously fired from the Broadway production of High Society for being difficult and having huge like blow up fits in rehearsals and things like that. And he was basically blacklisted from Broadway after High Society. So when Rosie got the rights to do Taboo, the question was, are you going to keep him as a director
because
New York doesn't want him back? And she did. She vouched for him. And then he wasn't able to, again, she's dealing with lawsuits and stuff. He's really like in charge of this production and wasn't able to fix what needed to be fixed. Okay, so to kind of recap with the Broadway production, despite the fact, it only played 100 performances and by all intents and purposes flopped, there are some awesome things about it, right?
Yes, I agree. I mean, the costumes were incredible, which it got nominated for Tonys for costume design as well as Drama Desk. And I think everyone can agree that those costumes were spectacular.
Spectacular. I mean, it's very rare. In fact, it wasn't until I saw Priscilla Queen of the Desert, is that the name of the title?
Yes, that's the title.
On Broadway, where there were dancing cupcakes during Someone Left the Cake Out in the Rain. Did I see costumes to even compare? But costumes, the score, again, you have mentioned it from a personal point of view. I would agree with that. There's some fantastic music in this, and it's so different than anything that opened that season. And like I said, even the critics who didn't like the show loved the score and thought it was one of the strongest pop scores that Broadway had seen in about 10 years, which is insane.
I mean, I think prior to this, even with Rent, I don't know that any Broadway score prior to this show sounded like that.
No, not
I
an
think
original,
that since
not an
then,
original
there have
score.
been a lot of shows that have been inspired by the sound,
right?
But up until that point, this had such a unique sound, which lends itself to, I'm sure, why there was so much excitement as well surrounding the show before it opened.
Right.
I also love the choreography as a dancer myself. It was so much fun to watch.
Oh, absolutely.
And I enjoyed it so much. And the performances were great.
I mean, Ewan Morton, who is fantastic.
Fantastic.
If you have not Googled him doing King George and Hamilton, you need to do it because it's not Jonathan Groff, but it's amazing. I think he was doing it right when the pandemic started last year.
Oh, no, really?
I think he was King George on Broadway right when the pandemic set in. But him, Raul Esparza, young Raul Esparza, like, hello, Liz McCartney, belting her face off with Talk Amongst Yourselves, which I know so many people who have that song in their audition book. And they probably don't even know it's from Taboo, but
Probably not.
Really awesome performances in the show. You know, people who were in it, Kristina, that you respect. One of my really good friends, Gregory Trico, Rich's, rest in peace, his husband, was in it, and he was the understudy for Boy George. So,
Oh, wow.
there you go.
That's incredible.
And some really awesome performances, really great message. Something that in 2003, I think, bringing a queer story. Again, it's so weird that these posters had men standing at urinals and they're giving out keychains with condoms in them because it's not really at the heart of the show what the story's about. And I think in, I don't know, 2020, a story like this, if it could be streamlined, would be a really positive message for a lot of young people, you know, who are finding themselves and finding acceptance in 2020 that we haven't seen in previous times before.
Yeah, I think that this actually is one of those shows that would really lend itself to a movie musical.
Right.
Not every show needs to be a movie, but I think that this show could really, really do well in that genre.
Especially after things like Rocket Man and
I loved Rocket Man. I know that's probably an unpopular opinion, but I absolutely loved Rocket Man.
Rocket Man, or I want to call it We Will Rock You, but that's not what it's called. It's called Bohemian Rhapsody. Thank you. I just remembered.
It's the other song.
The other song. One is a West End musical. One was a movie that won awards. But in that vein, but unlike both of those movies, this would have an original score, which I think is fascinating. This is a fun fact we haven't even mentioned yet, Kristina. This is the only time in history that a pop star has written a musical about themselves and starred in it. Like, that's
wow,
like,
really?
Yes.
There you
because, you know, Billy Joe Armstrong, Green Day, they wrote American Idiot, but it's not about Green Day.
No, it's not about them.
And so he was in it. So he hit two of those. But, and did Cyndi Lauper do, did she ever go into Kinky Boots?
No, she never went into it. Not that I know of, at least.
I mean, she's been on Broadway. That's the reason I ask. But yeah, it's crazy. Boy George wrote this musical about his life, and he also did it on Broadway. That's like, he won this weird, you know, triple crown that nobody else has ever won before. That's really awesome, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in that interview I talked about with Graham Norton, and in that interview he even says, he's like, well, it's kind of based on my life. It's not an exact life story. Not really, but kind of. Because they take a lot of liberties within his story.
Right.
But like you were saying, the full message of the show is really special, and certainly one that's not unique to one person. Do we think we got?
Right.
Oh, you know what? There's one thing I'd like to add. We talked about how they tried to take this show from a hole-in-the-wall club in the West End to make it Broadway glitzified, right?
Right.
But one thing that they didn't do that they could have done is they found every physical type, vocal type, the diversity within the show, even within the small characters, the one-liners, even within the ensemble, is immense, which is not normal, especially in 2003 for Broadway, right? Like, it was about finding the sexiest dancers and the best in shape and this, that, and the other. And it wasn't about that. It was about finding the talent and also finding the outsiders, so to speak, and bringing them into the show and making them the highlight of the show.
Yeah, Absolutely.
The show opens with the song talking about freaks. And it's so interesting that we talk about subcultures as freaks and how within the Broadway community, we have actually recaptured that word. It's no longer negative. Just like in Shrek, freak, let your freak flag fly. And it is about celebrating our differences. And they really went all the way with that idea in casting a super diverse group.
No, which is crazy because it's still pretty rare in 2020. This show was celebrated. I remember that. It was celebrated at the time for its diversity of types and especially body types and things like that. And coming off of something like Hairspray, which, the lead is celebrated because that was just right before Taboo opened on Broadway. It was thought to bring in a change, but it didn't. You know what I mean?
Well, no, the rest of that cast were all your atypical cookie cutter musical theater.
Right. Well, and so we've seen bits and pieces since Taboo, one of which, Kinky Boots. That's everyone I know is like, that's the show. It doesn't matter what you look like. You can be in Kinky Boots.
Oh, yeah.
And it's crazy to think that's written by another, pop star. But there aren't a ton. I've been to those
dance calls, friends. Everybody, every type, every body type shows up to those dance calls because it does not matter. Also, it doesn't matter if you're a dancer. You can be a mover and go to those calls. And they will hire you because it's not about being that atypical idea of beauty.
Right. Okay, Kristina. So why exactly did this show flop? I mean, we know it flopped because it didn't make its money back. And poor Rosie O'Donnell lost $10 million, which...
Yeah, I think that's the number one reason why it's considered a flop. But I also think the short run factors into that.
100 performances. I mean, if we want to go by Ken Mandelbaum, Not Since Carrie, his rule, 250 performances or less, it's a flop. This definitely qualifies according to the 250 performance mark, being less than that.
I also think that it lost its critical acclaim for the show as a whole.
Right.
There were aspects of the show that critics absolutely loved, and then there were aspects of the show that they tore apart.
Right. So it wasn't like it got rave reviews like Caroline or Change did, and then not, it's like this didn't get the best reviews. So that's probably a good marker as well.
Which reviews aren't everything, because I would say there's a larger cult following for something like Taboo than there is for Caroline or Change.
Another thing, the director is almost fired. Raul Esparza famously fought with Rosie O'Donnell. I mean, if there's a lot of backstage drama, that's probably a,
good indication that there's a bigger issue.
Right. And yeah, I think ahead of its time. I think that could be a marker for this. I think that Broadway wasn't ready for this story in 2003. It was not what Broadway was looking for. And it wasn't, I don't think, what American audiences were ready for, but I think that could be different now. So.
I agree. I totally agree. So someone with the money and the know-how, please pick this show up, give it a new lease on life, because it could be great.
All right, boys and girls. So for more information about Taboo, head on down to our website at www.myfavoriteflop.com for more information.
And be sure to follow us on all the socials at My Favorite Flop. We're going to be dropping more clues about our next episode.
Right, and the first clue for our next episode is this. It is based on an MGM movie musical.
What?
Right, that could be like 6 different things, but it's only one of them. It's only one of them. All right, and we'll also be posting links to music, videos, sheet music, if applicable, to this show and our last show. So if you want to, buy the cast album to Taboo, make sure you click on our website because we earn like 2 cents from that purchase, and we're poor people.
We can't wait to see you back here for our next episode of
My Favorite Flop.
Also, be like Dorothy. Stay at home. Wear a mask.
Bye, everybody.